I'm Marjorie Mead, Interim Director of the Marion E. Wade Center, and it is a joy to welcome you to this very special evening. Tonight is the launch of our second year of the Ken and Jean Hansen Lectureship. This annual Wheaton College Faculty Lecture Series is named in honor of former college trustee Ken Hansen and his wife Jean, and generously endowed in their memory by Walter and Darlene Hansen. We are privileged to have Dr. Timothy Larsen, McManus Professor of Christian Thought at Wheaton College, as our speaker for this series of 3 talks. The overarching theme for the series is the Rose Fire, George McDonald in the Age of Miracles. Dr. Larsen is a highly regarded scholar both here at Wheaton and throughout the academy. He has served as a visiting fellow at a number of prestigious universities, including All Souls College, Oxford, and Trinity College, Cambridge. Dr. Larsen's intellectual interests include British history, historical theology, and Christian thought. A prolific author, among his numerous published works are The Crisis of Doubt, Honest Faith in 19th Century England, A People of the Book, The Bible and the Victorians, and The Slain God, Anthropologists and the Christian Faith. Before Dr. Larsen comes to speak to us on George McDonald in the Age of the Incarnation, it is a special pleasure to invite Dr. Walter Hansen, who has been involved with the Wade Center since its inception and currently serves as a member of the Wade Board, to open our evening in prayer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hansen.
I know that Tim wanted to start this series in Advent, and one of our traditions in our family in this Advent season is to listen to the Messiah continuously from Thanksgiving. From ever I was a child, this was our custom, and always to go to one performance at least. So I was listening and thinking about tonight. And you know this section, I won't try to sing it or even hint at how it sounds. Who may abide the day of his coming? Who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire. And you know when they start singing that, it puts your heartbeat going about 10 times faster, the way it reverberates in your bones. For he is like a refiner's fire. And he shall purify the sons of Levi. I thought, well, Tim's going to be speaking on the rose fire. And I remember someplace where I read something by McDonald about consuming fire. It was a message by him, and Marge helped me look it up. And he quotes that verse, which is found both in Deuteronomy 4 and Hebrews 12. I'm not giving the talk tonight. Don't worry. This is a lead up to my prayer. Our God is a consuming fire. Nothing is inexorable but love. This fire is the fire of love, the fire that purifies us. For he is like a refiner's fire, and he shall purify the sons of Levi. And George McDonald ends this sermon, which I highly recommend to you. The man who loves God and is not yet pure courts the burning of God, nor is it always torture. The fire shows itself sometimes only as light. Still, it will be fire of purifying. The consuming fire is just the original, the active form of purity, that which makes pure, that which is indeed love, the creative energy of God. So I close with his prayer at the end of this sermon. For then our poor brothers and sisters and everyone, O God, we trust in thee, the consuming fire, shall have been burnt clean and brought home. As for us, now will we come to thee, our consuming fire. And thou wilt not burn us more than we can bear, but thou wilt burn us. And although thou seem to slay us, yet we will trust in thee. Amen.
If you come back for the third lecture, I'm going to focus on the rose fire and the consuming fire. And the third lecture is actually the best of the three. But tonight is not bad either, so you're all right. George MacDonald's second realist novel, Adela Cathcart, 1864, begins with a chapter titled Christmas Eve, and the rest of the action unfolds during the 12 days of Christmas. A group of neighbors and their holiday guests have formed themselves into a little club to tell one another stories during the festive season. Thus, not unlike the Arabian Nights, to which we shall return, Adela Cathcart is a collection of short stories held together by a framing narrative. One of these stories is My Uncle Peter. The hero, Peter Beitler, was born on December 25th. He delights in playing Secret Santa, spying out people who are in distress and leaving them anonymous packages of much-needed aid. The nephew narrator recalls, "Ah, my dear," he would say to my mother when she expostulated with him on making some present far beyond the small means he at that time possessed. "You see, I was born on Christmas Day." Moreover, Uncle Peter's jolly, generous soul is continually overflowing in sacrificial acts of kindness all the year round. Much of the action revolves around his giving a home to a poor orphan who is being exploited and abused, and his persistent efforts to find and rescue her when she is abducted by a wicked woman from her past. The story ends with the observation that Christmas Day makes all the days of the year as sacred as itself. The author of this tale, George MacDonald, was himself born during Advent, and like Uncle Peter or the reformed Ebenezer Scrooge, he also honored Christmas in his heart and tried to keep it all the year. In a tour de force piece of scholarship, the historian Boyd Hilton has identified the first half of the 19th century in Britain as the Age of Atonement, and the second half as the Age of the Incarnation. The Age of Atonement was a time when the focus was on Christ's work on the cross as a penal substitution, and when related themes loomed large, such as the wrath of God, the justice of God, and eternal punishment. Around 1850, the theological climate changed to one in which the central doctrine was the Incarnation, and along with it came an emphasis on themes such as the love of God and the fatherhood of God. This change was largely prompted by growing unease with the old doctrinal scheme. For example, theologians began to question whether it could really be considered right and just to allow an innocent person to be punished for the guilty. Once people began to shy away from defending the traditional theory of Christ's work on the cross, they found it difficult to formulate an alternative one, and therefore instead welcomed the idea of simply shifting the locus of gospel proclamation to another doctrine, from the cross to the cradle. Although Hilton brilliantly relates this theological shift to 19th century political, social, and economic attitudes and policies, he was not the first to discern it. In fact, the Victorians themselves were aware of it and commented on it. George MacDonald had been ordained as a congregational minister, and one of the greatest congregational pastors and theologians in 19th century Britain was R.W. Dale. In 1889, Dale gave an address that was then published, The Old Evangelicalism and the New. In it, he expounded to his audience on the contrast between the faith of their fathers and their own. The difference is due to many causes, and among these, very considerable importance must be attributed to the great place which is now given to the fact of the Incarnation. I do not mean that the death of Christ for the sins of men is denied by modern evangelicals. If it were denied, they would cease to be evangelicals. But it is practically relegated by many to a secondary position. The Incarnation, with all that it reveals concerning God, man, and the universe, concerning the life and the life to come, stands first. With the early evangelicals, the death of Christ for human sin stood first. Dale was a bridge-building theologian who was trying to bind the generations together in mutual respect and appreciation. Others, however, were less careful. Another Congregationalist, D.W. Simon, let the manger of Bethlehem thoroughly subsume and eclipse the cross of Calvary in a volume tellingly titled Reconciliation by Incarnation. This new doctrinal emphasis was, if anything, even stronger in the communion that McDonald made his spiritual home for most of his adult life, the Church of England. One of the most famous theological books of the late Victorian period was Lex Mundi, which was edited by Charles Gore, who would emerge as one of the most prominent of Anglican theologians and bishops. Lex Mundi, of course, means the light of the world, a theme that is proclaimed in the meditation on the Incarnation in the opening chapter of John's Gospel. That was the true light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Moreover, Lex Mundi had as its subtitle a series of studies on the religion of the Incarnation. In other words, the change was so complete that not only were these theologians and clergymen no longer emphasizing that they were determined to know nothing save Jesus Christ and Him crucified, but now they could even speak of the entirety of Christian faith and doctrine under the heading, the religion of the Incarnation. It was easy and commonplace, however, to think and speak that way in the late Victorian period. What is far more interesting are the trendsetters earlier in the century who pioneered this theological shift, often in the face of the spirited opposition of members of the older generation who were deeply committed to their own particular view of the nature of the atonement as at the heart of the Christian message. One such leader was the Anglican theologian Frederick Denison Morris. It would be difficult even to catalog all the numerous ways that George MacDonald bound himself in love and devotion to F.D. Morris. MacDonald was himself an early adopter of the gospel of the Incarnation and a pioneering spirit who experienced some opposition from the old guard. MacDonald therefore first became attracted to Morris through his writings and the attacks he endured because of them, sensing right away that they shared a theological affinity. They soon became friends. One of my favorite moments in their relationship is in 1856 when MacDonald became quite ill, his symptoms including coughing up blood. Morris visited him at his sickbed and read to him John Ruskin's moving account of the risen Christ revealing himself to his disciples while they were fishing in the Lake of Galilee. The MacDonalds eventually joined St. Peter's Church, Vere Street, London, and thus Morris became George MacDonald's pastor as well as his friend. MacDonald even wrote a poem in his honor, a thanksgiving for F.D. Morris, and dedicated a book to him, The Miracles of Our Lord. MacDonald also paid homage to Morris by turning him into a fictional character in one of his novels and organized a testimonial gift and tribute for him on the grounds that Morris was a teacher come from God. Perhaps most touchingly of all, Morris became the godfather of the MacDonalds' eighth child, a son whom they christened Morris in honor of their pastor, theologian friend who had come from God. As great-great-grandmother Irene so wisely observes in The Princess and the Goblin, a name is one of those things one can give away and keep all the same. I have a good many such things. As an undergraduate student, Morris was a member of the Cambridge Apostles, an exclusive intellectual society. In an illuminating study, the historian David Newsome has argued that their commitment to Platonic thought led the apostles of Morris's day, like early church fathers such as Justin Martyr before them, to focus on the Johannine teaching of the Logos, and therefore to lay particular stress on the Incarnation and its centrality within the Christian revelation. In Morris's controversial theological essays, 1853, while traditionalists focused their attacks on his willingness to call into question the necessity of believing in the traditional doctrine of eternal punishment, Morris also put forcibly his objections to the old view of the atonement, arguing that those notions are becoming more and more intolerable to thoughtful and earnest men. While writing during Advent 1876, the most distinguished Unitarian theologian of the Victorian age, James Martineau, observing developments among Trinitarians from the outside, gave Morris the bulk of the credit for this fundamental theological shift. He has been the cause of a radical and permanent change in the Orthodox theology, namely a shift of its center of gravity from the atonement to the Incarnation. A lot could be at stake in these doctrinal disputes. The McDonald's son, Greville, passed along a family anecdote regarding an aunt of his. Quote, one of the Mrs. Powell deferred for many months accepting her lover until he could formulate satisfactorily his views on the atonement, which at last, and most fortunately for the world, he contrived to do. The difference between the age of atonement and the age of the Incarnation was, however, often a generational divide. Part of the reason why McDonald's calling as the minister of the Congregational Church in Arundel was not successful was because his flock found their 20-something pastor's theological views too progressive. Tellingly, one of his theology professors from Highbury College, the place where he had trained for the ministry, recommended that McDonald look in instead for a congregation to serve that had a high percentage of young men in it. Several years later, when things were still not working out, McDonald would encourage himself in his calling with these words, I have to do something for the young people of this country. This generational divide is often dramatized in McDonald's novels. In his first realist novel, David Elginbrot, the foil is Mrs. Elton. She pronounces authoritatively on what a clergyman must include in his sermons. He ought, in order that men may believe, to explain the divine plan by which the demands of divine justice are satisfied and the punishment due to sin averted from the guilty and laid upon the innocent, that by bearing our sins he might make atonement to the wrath of a justly offended God. The new spiritual sensibility, by way of contrast, is represented by a boy named Harry. They were sitting in silence after the close when Harry started up suddenly, saying, I don't want God to love me if he does not love everybody, and bursting into tears, hurried out of the room. Mrs. Elton was awfully shocked at his wickedness. To McDonald's credit, however, the traditionalists are often presented sympathetically in his novels as people who are not themselves as heartlessly punitive as he suspects they ought to be given their creed. This approach of insisting that a severe figure nevertheless be thought of with affectionate respect is most thoroughly taken in the portrait of Robert Faulkner's grandmother, a formidable woman who is, as it were, the age of the atonement incarnate. Faulkner himself struggles his way to an incarnational theology centered on the revelation that God is love, resisting his granny's understanding of the scheme of salvation. But laddie, he came to satisfy God's justice by suffering the punishment due to our sins, to turn aside his wrath and curse. Over the course of several hundred pages, we watch as Robert Faulkner, on behalf of young people everywhere, rejects the harsh rigidities of the old faith and learns how to formulate the new. This dynamic is recapitulated in What's Mine's Mine. When Ian gives his spiritual testimony, his mother is distressed for the state of his soul by its omissions. There was nothing in it about the atonement. In a chapter titled The Gulf That Divided, the two of them have the great dialogue between the old and the new theology. Ian defiantly protests in what is, of course, McDonald's own view, I do not believe what you mean by the atonement. What God means by it, I desire to accept. There is a great gulf that divides here, indeed. As the raven observes in Lilith, you and I use the same words with different meanings. We are often unable to tell people what they need to know because they want to know something else and would therefore only misunderstand what we said. Tellingly, after McDonald has set aside the old theory of the atonement in The Gulf That Divided, we are led straight away, as it were, into the age of the Incarnation in the very next chapter, which is titled The Clan Christmas. All right. It's the first Christmas tree in England. And so we come to the Victorian Christmas. Today, when we think of celebrating the birth of Christ, our minds often gravitate to the 19th century. Our town of Wheaton here advertises its holiday events under the general heading, Dickens of a Christmas. We know that lots of features of Yuletide that feel traditional were first introduced to Britons and Americans in the Victorian age, not least Christmas cards and Christmas trees. What is less well known, however, is that it was during the 19th century that Christmas became the most wonderful time of the year. Previously, Easter held its preeminent place as the greatest of Christian festivals. Denominations influenced by the Reformation, the Reformed tradition, usually did not observe the birth of Christ at all. John Calvin really was the Grinch who stole Christmas. McDonald, of course, was a Scotsman who was taught the Westminster Catechism as a boy and raised in Scottish Calvinism. And the Church of Scotland did not even begin to have Christmas services until as late as 1873. In its early years, Wheaton College so much made a point of disregarding Christmas as to include it in the fall semester. In 1864, for instance, the final examinations for the term were held on December 26th. I am positing that this theological shift to the centrality of the doctrine of the Incarnation in the Victorian era was a contributing factor in the elevation of Christmas as the supreme holiday in the same period. F.D. Morris's first collection of sermons was suggestively titled Christmas Day and Other Sermons, 1843. In it, he refers to the celebration of the Nativity as the great Christian festival. Note the definite article. He did not even prudently say a great Christian festival, so as to leave a place for Easter to be at least on an equal plane. In his book-length dramatic poem Within and Without, McDonald referred to December 25th as this one day that blesses all the year. Likewise, Grenville MacDonald learned from his parents that Christmas is the day of days. The celebration of Christ's birth loomed large throughout his biography of his parents, and there is even an entire chapter on this theme, which is titled Deus Fidelis. While this has become so much to be expected for us that we would not find it much worth commenting upon, it was clearly viewed as a novelty at the time that the McDonald family prioritized gathering together every year for the Christmas season. And their enthusiastic celebrations were often commented upon by outsiders. Georgina Mount Temple, for example, reported on Christmas Eve 1883 at Borgagera, Italy, where the McDonalds had come to live and where she had rented a villa and was staying to recuperate after a bad fall. On Christmas Eve, we were dining in our little room looking at the olive wood, and we heard the sound of many voices, and looking out, lamps glimmering among the trees, and figures carrying lanterns and sheets of music. Who should they be but the dear McDonald family, visiting the houses of all the invalids in the place, to sing them carols and bring them the glad tidings of Christmas. The next day they had a beautiful tableau of the Annunciation, the stable, the angels, and the shepherds, ending up with the Madonna and Child. In their wonderful room, in their home, they had invited the peasants to come and join us for this novel representation of the events of the blessed Christmastide. In MacDonald's realist novels, there is often a Christmas chapter or scene, and there is even one in his long poem Within and Without. In Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, the narrator is a clergyman, and he explicitly states that his goal is to increase the importance of Christmas in his congregation. He prepares a sheet of Christmas hymns and carols, which contain the true meat of God's word in them, to distribute to his parishioners. And MacDonald cunningly reproduces it in toto in the novel as a kind of appendix to the chapter, so that his readers are also surreptitiously provided with a full kit for celebrating the birth of our Lord in all of its spiritual richness. MacDonald's Diary of an Old Soul is a book that offers a poem for every day of the year. In it, not only does he ignore the possible significance of any other date in the year, but the entry for December 25th even makes it explicit that he is violating this deliberate policy because Christmas is the single occasion in our annual calendar that cannot be ignored. Thou hast not made or taught me, Lord, to care for times and seasons, but this one glad day is the blue sapphire clasping all the lights that flash in the girdle of the earth so fair, when thou wast born a man, because always thou wast and art a man through all the flights of thought and time and thousandfold creation's play. Which leads us on to MacDonald's poetry. All right. In the poetical works of George MacDonald, in other words, that's a title of his poems all collected together, there is not a single poem which has any of the following words or any such related terms in its title: Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter, Atonement, Crucifixion, the Cross, Ransom, Blood, Sacrifice, Substitution, Justification, Propitiation, Golgotha, or Calvary. The closest is The Burnt Offering, a poem about making one's life a daily sacrifice unto God. On the other hand, there are no less than 14 poems that have the word Christmas in their very title, and numerous others besides these which are also Christmas poems. In another illustration of my point, when Robert Browning published Christmas Eve and Easter Day, a poem, 1850, MacDonald wrote a review that completely ignored the Easter half and instead discussed exclusively Christmas Eve. In his unspoken sermons, as he had explicitly set aside penal substitution, MacDonald imagined readers asking him what then his own theory of the work of Christ on the cross is, to which he defiantly replies, I answer, none. Again, an apophatic approach to a doctrine is likely to make one rather taciturn on the subject. From clues from his letters, by contrast, it is clear that MacDonald was in the habit of writing a Christmas poem annually as part of his own personal celebration of the holiday. In fact, a handful of poems in the published collection simply have the date for their title: Christmas Day, 1878, Christmas, 1880, and so on. Moreover, to MacDonald's great credit, his Yule poems are about the good news of the coming of God as a human being into the world, rather than focused on the cultural aspects of the season. Christmas 1884 even goes so far as to set the one against the other. Though in my heart no Christmas glee, though my songbird be dumb, Jesus, it is enough for me that thou art come. One of my favorites is The Sleepless Jesus. It is so much better than the Victorian carol Away in the Manger, with its docetic tinge, no crying he makes. In MacDonald's version, Jesus is a real human baby who, to the frustration of his worn-out mother, is not cooperating with the bedtime ritual. Here is the opening stanza. "'Tis time to sleep, my little boy. Why gaze thy bright eyes so? At night our children for new joy home to thy father go. But thou art wakeful. Sleep, my child. The moon and stars are gone. The wind is up and raving wild, but thou art smiling on." The American Civil War led to great distress and deprivation for the laboring classes in the north of England, as so much of the economy of the region was based on textile mills, which used as their raw material cotton supplied by the southern states. Moreover, these workers had heroically agreed to their own personal ruin, that the need to stand against the evil of slavery meant that boycotting the Confederacy was the right policy to pursue. Here is the first stanza of MacDonald's A Christmas Carol for 1862, the year of the trouble in Lancashire. "The skies are pale, the trees are stiff, the earth is dull and old. The frost is glittering as if the very sun were cold. And hunger fell is joined with frost to make men thin and wan. Come, babe, from heaven, or we are lost. Be born, O child of man." When he had sent his annual Christmas poem to his friend in December 1886, MacDonald remarked on its theme, the Nativity. "If the story were not true, nothing else would be worth being true. Because it is true, everything is lovely, precious." MacDonald also wrote Christmas-themed short stories. The most poignant of these is The Gifts of the Child Christ. Mrs. Greatorex is a 20-something wife who has a little girl they call Fossey and is pregnant with their second child. Her husband, however, has been becoming more and more skeptical and dismissive of spiritual realities, as he is correspondingly becoming more materialistic. In an ominous sign regarding the state of his eternal soul, we are told that he had given up reading poetry. Mr. Greatorex's heart is also becoming more and more emotionally detached from his wife. and anxious and not knowing what to do, she senses that she is losing him. Meanwhile, Fosse, being but a child, has the import of Advent all jumbled up. From some of the preacher's sayings about the birth of Jesus into the world, into the family, into the individual human bosom, she had got it into her head that Christmas Day was not a birthday like that she had herself last year, but that in some wonderful way, to her requiring no explanation, the baby Jesus was born every Christmas afresh. Mrs. Greatorex goes into labor during the night before Christmas, but the baby is stillborn. Its dead body is placed in the spare room, where Fosse, rising early on Christmas morn, as children are wont to do, discovers it all by herself, not knowing the tragic event that had unfolded while she lay sleeping. Eventually, she is found by the rest of the household. Jesus is dead, she said, slowly and sad, but with perfect calmness. He is dead, she repeated. He came too early, and there was no one to take care of him, and he's dead, dead, dead. This ghastly scene jolts her father back into spiritual vitality. Rising to the moment, he makes a true confession. No, no, Fosse, they heard him say. Jesus is not dead, thank God. It is only your little brother that hadn't life enough and has gone back to God for more. Faith and family are both renewed. Such were the gifts the Christ child brought to one household that Christmas. The more substantive point, however, is not that McDonald wrote about Christmas, but that he is a fine representative of the age of the Incarnation in terms of the theological themes that he stressed throughout his life, work, sermons, and ministry. Central to his message was the fatherhood of God. God's great father heart reveals that he is fundamentally a God of love, and that this inexhaustible divine love is directed specifically towards us, his children. Papa's Story, a Scots Christmas story, is a modern retelling of the parables of the lost sheep and of the prodigal son. Biblical passages that McDonald would return to again and again because they reveal that God is a loving Father. In the Incarnation, the Son came to earth to make known to us his Father in heaven. During his earthly life, Jesus of Nazareth modeled for us how to be a true, obedient child of the Father. One of McDonald's favorite Christological titles, therefore, was to refer to Jesus as our elder brother. What it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ is to be born again and to become like a child. The very first chapter in McDonald's unspoken sermons is The Child in the Midst, a meditation on God's call for us to become childlike. Let the little children come unto me and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. And at the back of the North Wind, Diamond is made fun of for being simple-minded, for having a tile loose. He is referred to derisively as God's baby. But this just shows how little spiritual discernment some people have, for of God's gifts, a baby is of the greatest. To live the Christian life is to have the Incarnation become a reality in our hearts. We must become as little children, and Christ must be born in us. We therefore need a little Christmas right this very moment. It is as if God spoke to each of us according to our need. My son, my daughter, you are growing old and cunning. You must grow a child again. With my son, this blessed birth time. You are growing old and selfish. You must become a child. You are growing old and careful. You must become a child. You are growing old and distrustful. You must become a child. You are growing old and petty and weak and foolish. You must become a child. My child, like the baby there, that strong sunrise of faith and hope and love lying in his mother's arms in the stable. Our true spiritual destiny, therefore, is not to grow old, but to grow young. At the end of their adventure, Tangle and Mossy are not only better, stronger, and wiser, but even younger than they had ever been before. In Lilith, we hear these words of eschatological hope for our ultimate sanctification. Sooner or later, all will be little ones. To celebrate her 56th birthday, McDonald composed these lines for his friend Georgina Cooper Temple. Up the hill of years to the peak of youth, there the mist of fears veils no more the truth. There we children all shall meet and play about the Father's feet. MacDonald's poem, Christmas Song of the Old Children, is addressed to Jesus, who is given the Christological title, Child of All Eternity, and it includes the lines, childhood all from thee doth flow, melt to song our age's snow. And MacDonald practiced what he preached. G.K. Chesterton dubbed him St. Francis of Aberdeen. And I think part of what makes that startling comparison apt is the childlike quality in both the Protestant author from Aberdeen and the medieval saint from Assisi. George MacDonald was an old soul whose deep wisdom was that God wants us to learn how to be a child again. Delightfully conforming to our mental picture of what a Victorian boy might receive for a Christmas present, MacDonald even had a collection of toy soldiers, which he added to and played with throughout his adult life. As the narrator reflects in David Elginbrot, I do not think that any man is compelled to bid goodbye to his childhood. Moreover, Christmas does not just remind us that God himself once became a baby in Jesus Christ, but rather it reveals to us a deep, abiding truth about the very nature of the Almighty. As MacDonald expounded in an unspoken sermon, God is childlike. Let me then ask, do you believe in the Incarnation? Our Lord became flesh, and he was, is, and ever shall be divinely childlike. Childhood belongs to the divine nature. In within and without, we are told that the Nativity brought godlike childhood to the aged earth. Thus, the Victorians have also taught us that children should be at the heart of our Christmas celebrations. This too seems so obvious as to be self-evident to us, but it was not always so. The medieval Christmas was in spirit much more like how we think of New Year's Eve, a time for adult revelry, including gambling. Even the gift-giving was about reinforcing formal relationships between adults within a hierarchical social world. The age of the Incarnation insisted that Yuletide festivities should be geared towards children and domestic life. One popular tradition was reading stories around the fireside. This is a point, however, at which we realize that we have also diverged in some ways from 19th century customs. If the medieval Christmas was more akin to New Year's Eve, so the Victorian Christmas had affinities with Halloween. In particular, the Christmas season was a traditional time to tell ghost stories. We still have a trace of a memory of this in popular culture today in the song, "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year." There will be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago. And it is easy for us to forget that Dickens's A Christmas Carol is actually a ghost story. Moreover, it was just one of a series of ghost stories that Dickens wrote over the years for families to enjoy as part of their celebrations of the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. Reinforcing yet more strongly the Halloween connection, one of Dickens's Christmas stories was even called The Haunted House. Moreover, by extension, Yuletide was a time for stories about all sorts of creatures. Weird and wondrous, sinister, supernatural and mysterious, mythical, fantastical, and fabulous. I assure you that I have no desire to try to turn Jo March into a proper and conventional lady. But it was not startling when Little Women was published in 1869, the way it would be for us now, that Jo wrote a play to be performed on Christmas Day titled The Witch's Curse. And so, as promised, we return to the Arabian Nights, which was one of the MacDonald family's favorite collections of stories for Christmas reading. The character Robert Faulkner's own initial encounter with the Arabian Nights was exquisite beyond description. I shrink from all attempt to set forth in words the rainbow-colored delight that coruscated in his brain. McDonald's granddaughter, Lilia Mary, as a Christmas gift, in the Wade collection, there is a copy which is inscribed to McDonald's granddaughter, Lilia Mary, as a Christmas gift, but also includes a slip of paper that says, "A Happy Christmas," and is signed George McDonald. We own the original, it's in the building. I could be wrong, but I read this note not as a seasonal greeting, as in I wish you a happy Christmas, but rather as a shortened version of the phrase, "That was a happy Christmas." In other words, as a recorded tribute to a fondly remembered Christmas when they read these stories aloud together as a family, which indeed we know that they did do. In short, for the Victorians, the annual celebration of the birth of our Lord was a perfect time to relish a story about a magician, a wondrous lamp, and an enormous and frightful genie. We have discussed McDonald's Christmas poems, short stories, and scenes in his novels. But as we bring this lecture to a conclusion, I want to point out that even many of McDonald's works that were not about Christmas were nevertheless for Christmas. His first book was a work of translation, 12 of the spiritual songs of Novellis, which he had privately printed in 1851 as a Christmas gift for his friends. His first proper book, Within and Without, 1855, was being published with timing it for Christmas very much in mind. And the last story George McDonald ever wrote, Far Above Rubies, appeared in The Sketch in its Christmas 1898 issue. Thus, Christmas time was the alpha and omega of McDonald's entire publishing life. And this Advent calendar was also true of innumerable publications in between. Most notably, McDonald thought of Phantastes as a fairy tale or something of the sort for the Christmas season. As another Victorian example of the connection between Yuletide and scary stories of spirits, it is worth noting that the Anglo-Catholic poet Christina Rossetti wrote Goblin Market as a Christmas book. To return to the text which we began this lecture, Adol's aunt, Mrs. Cathcart, is a foil in the novel. This is Christmas time, you know, and just the time for storytelling, I added. I trust it is a story suitable to the season, said Mrs. Cathcart, smiling. Yes, very, I said, for it is a child's story, a fairy tale, namely, though I confess I think it fitter for grown than for young children. Thus, delightfully, this fictitious holiday gathering is treated during the 12 days of Christmas to some of McDonald's own fairy tales, including The Light Princess and The Giant's Heart. Writing fantasy stories for the Christmas market was, of course, a business decision for McDonald, but it was wonderfully in keeping with his childlike nature to find a way to get the fairies to pay his bills. Moreover, there are surely more profound connections in the subterranean depths of fairyland. Mrs. Cathcart complains that even the clergyman in their party has told a tale at Christmas time that has nothing Christian in the story. She receives this reply. I allow in the words there is nothing Christian, answered Mr. Armstrong, but I cannot allow that in spirit and scope it is anything other than Christian, or indeed anything but Christian. It seems to me that the whole might be used as a Christian parable. William Rapier has observed how often in McDonald's fantasy writings there recurs the theme of royalty disguised as peasantry, which of course is an extraordinarily apt parable indeed for the doctrine of the Incarnation. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords, wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. Still, we must not travel any further in that direction, lest, in a misguided effort to answer her, we end up becoming too much like stuffy old Mrs. Cathcart. In marked contrast to Adele's aunt, we are told of Uncle Peter, when he had finished his tea, he turned his chair to the fire and read, what do you think? Sensible Travels and Discoveries? Or Political Economy? Or Popular Geology? No, fairy tales! As many as he could lay his hands on, and when they failed him, romances or novels. No. As much as we would like to reassure Mrs. Cathcart that all is well and soundly Christian, we cannot seriously bring ourselves to believe that jolly old Uncle Peter was reading these fairy tales for their didactic capacity to communicate Chalcedonian Christology. Yet neither do we suspect that his Savior, whose birthday he shared, was any the less pleased with him for all that. And we can say the same for George MacDonald himself. It is enough that his godly, Christ-like, Christ-loving soul delighted in fantasy stories of fairies, not least at Christmas time. Why should he not have been allowed to enjoy himself in this way? After all, was he not born during Advent? And did he not live in the age of the Incarnation? Thank you.
Tim, thank you for so insightfully and winsomely ushering us into Advent. We're all grateful. We look forward to the next 2 lectures in this series. They'll be in February and March 2017. So I think you've all received a little card with the dates, and it's also on our website. And I should note that this evening is being recorded and will eventually be on our website at all if you'd like to refer those who weren't able to be here tonight, or if you'd like to listen to it again. Before I introduce our faculty respondent, it's a great joy to be able to announce that InterVarsity Press Academic will be our publisher for the Hansen Lectureship books. IVP is a wonderful partner for the Hansen Lecture Series, and we couldn't be more delighted. We're equally delighted to have Dr. David McNutt as our series editor. David asked me to convey his regrets, to you especially, Tim and Jim, that he couldn't be here this evening. He's actually teaching a Wheaton College class right now, so good excuse. But he also wanted to let us know of IVP's great pleasure in being joined to the Wade Center in this series. The first book will be coming out next year, and will be President Reichen's Hansen Lectures. Those of you who were able to be with us last year recall they were on Tolkien, and it's the title for the series was The Messiah Comes to Middle-earth, Images of Christ's Threefold Office in the Lord of the Rings. We anticipate that we'll do a book and series launch roughly a year from now, when Dr. Christine Cologne will be giving her first Hansen lecture on Dorothy L. Sayers. So get the idea. We're doing this every year. That's what it is. I also want to mention that Dr. Larsen's talks, once they are published in 2 years, that'll be autumn 2018, any Wheaton College student who's here tonight is eligible to be entered into a drawing for a signed copy of Dr. Larsen's book once it's out. So on your way out tonight, just stop by the front reception desk. There's little slips to fill out, and for each of the lectures you come, you'll have more opportunity to be the winner, and we will draw it after the final talk in March. But once again, this is for Wheaton College students only. We're delighted to have Dr. Jim Beitler, Assistant Professor of English at Wheaton College, as the faculty respondent to Dr. Larsen's talk. Dr. Beitler's primary areas of academic interest include rhetorical theory and criticism, composition, pedagogy, and community-based writing. Dr. Beitler also serves as coordinator of first-year writing, and significantly, in terms of Wade history, he teaches Christianity and fantasy. That's the English department course, which is actually a descendant of modern mythology, which our founder, Dr. Clyde Kilby, developed in the early 1970s. And that course was one of the first courses, certainly in the U.S., and the first course on Wheaton College's campus on the Wade authors. Now, following Dr. Beitler's response, we'll take a very short break just to set up for the Q&A. I encourage you to stay and participate in that and be able to ask both Dr. Beitler and Dr. Larsen any follow-ups you have. But we know that not everybody's schedule will allow this, so if you need to slip out for any reason, following Dr. Beitler's remarks would be a good time to do so. So, thank you, Jim.
It is an absolute privilege to serve as the respondent to Tim's first Hansen lecture. Thank you so much to the Wade Center staff, Walter and Darlene Hansen, and to Tim for such a wonderful talk and invitation as well. My response is entitled Seasoned Readings on George McDonald's In the Age of the Incarnation. And when I read an early draft of Tim's talk, what first caught my attention was just the sheer amount of evidence he had marshaled in support of his argument. I was further impressed and delighted when he sent me another draft, in which he had attempted, as he put it, quote, to stir more pecans into the McDonald Christmas fruitcake. My admiration and delight turned to awe, however, when I received the next version. The subject line of the email read, more pecans. This is not an argument lacking in evidence. That said, the pecan as evidence metaphor is a bit misleading because Tim is able to bring together so many different types of evidence to make the case that McDonald is a fine representative of the age of the Incarnation. He serves as historical evidence, Boyd Hilton's distinction, biographical evidence, McDonald's relationship with Morris, his love for Yuletide ghost stories, and his practice of gifting works to others, literary evidence, analysis of characters and themes in McDonald's novels and poems, and theological evidence, McDonald's views about Christian maturity and his understanding of God as divinely childlike. This is holiday fare indeed, seasoned with many flavors. It's also an especially timely talk, even occasional. Of course, all academics want their scholarship to be timely in relation to the conversations in their field, and Tim's work is certainly kairotic in this respect. He was a featured speaker at a meeting of the George McDonald Society just this past summer in Cambridge. But it's timely for other reasons as well. Rhetoricians have long maintained that ceremonies, festivals, and seasons are moments of rhetorical potential, and Larsen's talk proves this to be right, speaking to us with even more meaning on this dark night in Advent than it would at other times of the year. The argument is relevant to us not only for what it says to us about McDonald, but because it resonates with the theological emphases of the season we're awaiting. The talk invites us to think about ways that we might tap into the rhetorical potential of the Christian year, even as we do our work in our disciplines. It's timely in a rhetorical sense, but also in an interpretive one. Tim suggests that to fully understand McDonald's writings, we need more than a theological statement about the Incarnation. We need to know something about the theological currents of the age and Victorian Christmas practices, such as the emphasis on ghost stories, for example. This approach rightly implies that we need interpretive approaches that recognize that our theologies and our timekeeping practices are interwoven and often mutually constitutive of one another. In sum, the talk tonight was both a rhetoric and a hermeneutic, reminding us of the abundant resources our calendar offers for guiding our efforts as readers and writers. As I thought about responding to Tim, I played around with the idea of exploring the writings of another Wade Center author in light of Hilton's comments about the age of the Incarnation. Given Lewis's emphasis on the Incarnation, his writings, and as well as his affection for McDonald, for that matter, he would have made a particularly good choice. In his piece, The Grand Miracle, he basically talks about Christ's death and resurrection as an extension of the Incarnation. However, as I began drafting my own response, I found myself drawn away from Lewis to the very place that Tim warned us of traveling, the subterranean depths of fairyland. More specifically, I wondered, do we hear echoes of Tim's points about the age of the Incarnation in Fantastes? Once the question was raised, it took hold of me, and I found myself pulled into fairyland with a notice. Reading Fantastes with Larsen's thesis in mind, we're confronted with a seeming difficulty right off the bat related to the development of Enotus's character. For one thing, the climax of the story involves a sacrificial death. In an act of selfless love, Enotus dies, killing a great and terrible beast. His death prevents his master, a knight, from being deceived by the evil creature, and ensures that the knight's love with the marble lady will endure. Famously praised by Lewis for its portrayal of a good death, Fantastes would seem to say more to us about the atonement than the Incarnation. Secondly, Enotus's death results in a kind of disembodied state. Enotus reports that, quote, the souls of his passions rose above their vanishing earthly garments and disclosed themselves angels of light. But oh, how beautiful beyond the old form. I lay thus for a long time, satisfied in still contemplation and spiritual consciousness. Enotus, whose name I should note can mean ascent, eventually ends up floating on a, quote, feathery cloud high above the world, again, seeming to move us in the opposite direction of incarnation. Let me pause at this point to remind you that though Tim's argument illuminates a great deal about McDonald's work, he never claimed that the Incarnation would make sense of everything McDonald wrote. What's more, Tim has specifically warned us to be wary of making too much of his thesis in relation to fairyland, and rightly so. McDonald, as McDonald himself argues in his essay, The Fantastic Imagination, the meanings of good fairy tales are myriad. Everyone who feels the story, McDonald writes, quote, will read its meaning after his own nature and development. One man will read one meaning in it, another will read another, end quote. Given such views, we can be certain that McDonald's primary aim in writing fairy tales was not, as Tim put it, for their didactic capacity to communicate Chalcedonian Christology. Even so, I think Tim's argument does help us understand Fantastes. It's worth noting, first of all, that the book offers us yet another connection between McDonald and Morris. Morris assisted McDonald in acquiring a publisher for the book. Presumably, he did not find anything in its pages that offended his theological sensibilities too much. Secondly, and more importantly, there are many times throughout Fantastes when Anotus's ascent requires that he, in Tim's words, grows young. At one point, Anotus tells us that, quote, it is no use trying to account for things in fairyland, and one who travels there soon learns to forget the very idea of doing so and takes everything as it comes, like a child, who, being in a chronic condition of wonder, is surprised at nothing. Thirdly, whatever else it may be, Fantastes is a ghost story. In addition to being haunted by troubling memories from his past, Anotus is bewitched by an evil ash tree, tormented by his shadow, and made to pass through the door of dismay and even his own tomb. After his death in fairyland, he even envisions himself as a kind of ghost, crying out, "O pale-faced women and gloomy-browed men and forgotten children, how I will wait on you and minister you, and putting my arms around you in the dark, think hope into your hearts when you fancy no one is near." It's basically the plot summary of the movie Ghost. Without Patrick Swayze, of course. Which brings us back to Anotus's disembodied consciousness. Though that is where his time in fairyland ends, it's not where the book ends. Shortly after imagining he will haunt the disheartened people of the world, he's jolted from fairyland, returning to an embodied existence. With this, Anotus tells us, a pang and a terrible shudder went through me, arriving as of death convulsed me, and I became once again conscious of a more limited, even a bodily and earthly life. Though we might make more of this passage if the embodied Anotus was not so distressed about his earthly life and not so perplexed about how to translate his ghostly compassion into the world of things, the scene offers us a clear echo of the Incarnation, demonstrating that the doctrine found its way even into McDonald's other worlds. Again, we can't get from Anotus's descent to Chalcedon directly, but we can, I think, point to this moment as a place in the narrative where McDonald is drawing on his faith to advance the story. Actually, I think a decent case can be made that Chalcedon permeates Fantastes in an even more fundamental way. But to understand how, we have to take a step back from Anotus's character to consider the book's two primary settings, the real world and fairyland. Stephen Prickett, who wrote a book called Victorian Fantasy, his comments are helpful here. Prickett writes, quote, "In these books, the two worlds appear to coexist perfectly within our world. Though the transitions from the real world to the fantastical world are often unexpected, they do not involve magical metamorphoses or mysterious entrances like cupboards or mirrors. All they demand is something that approximates very closely to faith. That is not just belief or even acceptance, but a very positive moral quality that involves, among other things, acting on trust." Unquote. Prickett ultimately frames his discussion about faith as the means of transitioning between the real world and fairyland in terms of McDonald's Platonism. He calls McDonald a temperamental Platonist at one point. But his reading leaves us ample room to see echoes of the Incarnation, and more specifically the two natures of Christ in McDonald's primary and secondary worlds. In fact, Prickett himself points us in this direction. He notes that for McDonald, the world we inhabit, quote, "is the meeting place of two very different kinds of realities, neither of which is fully capable of accounting for everyday experience." He goes on to say, "Materialism is forced to be reductionist with spiritual experiences. Mysticism often fails to account for material forces. There's no easy reconciliation between the two worlds. In human experience, they remain as they appear, polar opposites. And then he says this, tragedy is a perpetual possibility. As the crucifixion must remind Christians, there is no easy reconciliation. Though Prickett does not elaborate on this remark, his comment suggests that though Chalcedonian Christology is not explicitly articulated in Fantastes, it may be relevant. Let me conclude my response by taking one more step back, moving from a consideration of McDonald's fantasy worlds to his reflections on fantasy, his own reflections on fantasy. In his essay, The Fantastic Imagination, which I cited earlier, McDonald suggests that the true fairy tale, that is, the fairy tale that can be called a work of art, generates meanings beyond the author's intentions. He frames his position in response to an imaginary conversation partner who wants to cling to the notion that meaning depends primarily on authorial aims. This imaginary second voice asks, must a fairy tale have meaning? To which McDonald replies with the line I quoted earlier, everyone who feels a story will read its meaning after his own nature and development. One will read one meaning in it, another will read another. Later, McDonald continues, a genuine work of art must mean many things. The truer its art, the more things it will mean. Here, McDonald presents us with a view of creativity that sounds a lot like an early version of reader response theory, but there's a twist. For McDonald, the source of a work's many meanings is neither its author's intentions nor its reader's interpretations, but rather the author of all meaning. He says this, for in everything that God has made, there is layer upon layer of ascending significance. Also, he, that is God, expresses the same thought in higher and higher kinds of thought. It is God's things, his embodied thoughts, which alone a man has to use, modified and adapted to his own purposes for the expressions of his thoughts. I feel like I'm traveling into truly perilous territory now. If only there was someone I could turn to for historical, theological, and even anthropological insights about the meaning of this passage. However, I will venture to say that while we do hear assent, Platonism in this description of meaning-making, it is indeed a temperamental Platonism, accented by McDonald's Christianity. Humans, McDonald writes, use God's things, his embodied thoughts, to express ourselves creatively. I certainly hear echoes of the Incarnation here, and I'm more convinced that they are present after listening to Tim's talk. I've also got time on my side. After all, is it not now Advent? And do we not find ourselves longing once again to celebrate the birth of our Lord? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. We appreciate you putting the icing on Tim's McDonald fruitcake. So just take a moment, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So thank you.
Which marzipan?
Sorry.
You know, just like I said. You guys are up.
Want to go now?
So if people have a question, they just stand up and. Oh, you're gonna.
He's going to start with a question.
Yeah, and then you can. Wow.
All right, I think we'll get started with the Q&A. Questions for Tim. I will ask the first question. That's my special right. And I want to kind of build off of Walter's introduction and ask about the Rose Fire. So you have called this series The Rose Fire, George MacDonald and the Age of Miracles. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I got this, Mike. You're good. So the Rose Fire thing will dominate the third lecture, which is the best of the three. Again, come back. But I've got 3 teenage children, and we've spent almost a decade now reading lots of youth fantasy fiction in our house. And I tend to get sucked in sometimes to read some of it, but my wife reads a lot more of it. And I've learned that you want those kind of titles, those kind of cool titles. So my last book, The Slain God, I got all these titles I could think of that might fit the book, and I gave it to my children, and I said, which of these would you read if it was youth fantasy fiction? And they chose The Slain God. And so I did the same thing in the Rose Fire one for this one. So I kind of have a theory now that a title should work on its own, irrelated to what the book is about. Obviously, it has to relate to what the book's about, but it has to just stand on its own to kind of draw you in. So the children won with the Rose Fire.
Other questions? Jerry.
This is going to take a second, but it seems to me the opposition between incarnation and atonement is artificial. And if you lean towards the atonement, then it's apathetic, and we're trying to somehow consider the God who's far off. If you go towards the incarnation, it becomes cataphatic. You got way of affirmation, way of negation, and this conflict that seems to be more resolved by Charles Williams, who says we should say of everything, this also is thou, neither is this thou. And what I was wondering too, Jim, when you said the opposition, or you said the cross shows us there's no easy reconciliation, but nevertheless the atonement reconciles. So what I'm wondering is do you feel that this thing that happened, this divide in the 1800s, was something that was very dangerous for Christianity, and it would have been better if somehow we could have kept them together?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in my mind, it's kind of Hegelian. So I think there's this atonement, and then there's incarnation, and then there's a new synthesis that comes after this. So P.T. Forsyth writes the cruciality of the cross deliberately to bring congregationalism, which is McDonald and these people, Simon, that he put back into seeing the importance of the cross. So I see what's happening in the age of the incarnation as a kind of corrective, which we can see the importance of the incarnation, but hold on to atonement and put them together. And so it's their moment in history, but it's not our moment in history. We can learn from them without staying where they were. I think you're right that you need to end up with a synthesis.
Well, following on it, this was so wonderful. Do you think that the dead baby is atonement through the back door? Because it doesn't. Nothing happens until the baby dies. Who is Jesus? Is that a slipping?
Yeah, no, that's a great reality. What surprised me most about reading McDonald in this series was the way that the Victorian scholars talk about Romanticism and the age of the incarnation is it's all very sentimental. And McDonald has a gritty theology in lots of ways. It's not a sentimental theology. It faces down a lot of unpleasant realities. I was thinking when Jim gave his response, there's a McDonald princess fairy story where there's a curse the princess is under, and the boy gives his life, dies drowning, a voluntary act. What's it called? The Light Princess. And McDonald has this wonderful phrase where he says, the wonderful thing about writing fiction is it's not easy to lie in it. And I think maybe, I'm just thinking because I've heard Jim, I hadn't had this thought until I heard Jim, but maybe the atonement is actually more there in his fantasy writing and in his fiction writing, because he doesn't have to have a theory of the atonement. He can just have the reality of sacrifice in the stories. And so, yeah, I think it does recur over and over. And you put that with Fantastes, yeah.
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious, it's a different tack, but the Victorian age and the culture with the innocentization of childhood, how does that affect George MacDonald's writings? Would that impact the whole shift from atonement to incarnation?
What happens with childhood? I missed it.
How it's become more innocent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly again, that's where you get the Victorian sentimentality. The fact that children, there becomes a kind of cult of childhood in the Victorian age. I mean, McDonald is part of inventing children's literature, along with his friend Lewis Carroll and others at that time. Until then, kids were just, taught to read and then given Puritan theology or whatever was in the house, And that's why all kids loved Pilgrim's Progress, because it was the one kind of thing that felt like a narrative with giants and castles and things that kids could get in the house, because they didn't write children's literature. So yeah, there definitely is this new child focus that's happening in the Victorian age, and that's helping. All these things are reinforcing one another.
Yes.
I'm curious about what feels like a tension to me between this focus on incarnation, which for me feels very much about embodiment and in some ways is a celebration of that, and yet the fascination with ghost stories and this sort of disembodied spirituality. Do you think for McDonald or other Victorians, was the incarnation almost more significant as a spiritual reality and not as connected as it would be for me as a materiality and what it means for human bodies even? Was there more of a spiritual focus on the incarnation?
Yeah, I have thoughts, Suzanne, but Suzanne's spent years of her life studying 19th century theology, so you might have thoughts as well. If that was a way of you saying, I actually know something, you could just say what you know. Okay, you have the right to just lecture us as well. But McDonald has a very strong belief in the afterlife. It's a really important, even in his personal circle, with his in-laws, he kind of wins that family over because somebody in the family dies, and his confidence in the afterlife is just so resounding. And that's his whole life. But the resurrection of the body doesn't seem central in his. Not that he's rejecting it, but it's much more. He's not thinking embodied very strongly, is my instinct. He's not rejecting any of it. He doesn't have a problem with it, but yet he does, I think, default to a kind of Platonic. There's a person within the body, and that lives on.
You mentioned that as well. I forget who it was you were talking about. It was the kind of Platonic notion of the logos as it relates to the incarnation.
Yeah,
so there's a connection there somehow.
Yeah, you're allowed to ask questions of Jim as well. He's a literary scholar, and I'm not. So jump in if you want.
Other questions?
You have passing reference to, this is kind of not docetic, like away in the act, no crying Canadian kind of thing. And then I kept thinking at different points how you emphasize you just now, the grittiness, the earthiness. Do you have that sense that there was a kind of anti-Gnosticism, anti-asceticism in his writings? I mean, is there any clue that was part of his thinking? That made me think of Irenaeus and the whole theme of recapitulation and that becoming childlike in essence. Because recapitulates our whole story and we enter into that recapitulation. But I have no recollection of any connection that he would have made along those lines.
Yeah, again, the grittiness is the part that I guess that I can see the clearest, which is right out of your opening prayer, that our God is a consuming fire. The fact that God is willing to inflict pain for your good, the fact that this is a process that's not easy all the time, a little bit of what Jim was talking about with it being a costly, painful reconciliation. There are other Victorians who are sliding into this very sentimental romantic theology, but McDonald doesn't do that. That's what I see.
In Fantastes in particular, I mean, there's this constant movement toward this dreamlike state and dreaming and falling asleep and disembodiment, but there is that bloody death at the end. It is gritty in that way, yeah.
And part of the grittiness, or I should say earthiness of his stories includes those who would be considered today, maybe we'd say mental disabilities, and one of the stories that the boy running around in the cave saying, Father of lights, Father of lights, Father of lights. which story that is, and yet he's not diminished or discarded by McDonald. He's valued in that way. And you refer to the fact of the north wind, so there's that sense of real empathy and inclusion for those who don't meet what we might think as normal standards of humanity.
Rob of the Angels and What's Mine's Mine is another example of that. But again, to write a Christmas story for the Christmas market and have a baby born as a stillborn child, that's just, that wouldn't happen in Christian fiction today, I don't think. Fiction meant for ordinary Christians to read as their Christmas reading. And he just wants to unflinchingly say, this hard thing happened, and it brought about good in the life of this family, and it was God's way of bringing spiritual reality and family reconciliation.
Maybe we can just pull back for a second. Oh, another question? Yeah.
Tim, when you started out, I believe you mentioned something about McDonald in his pastoral. And didn't go well.
Yeah.
And I've never gotten into the depth of that, though I've heard he had trouble in the pastorate. Did that have to do with his movement toward the incarnation over the atonement, or were there other things in his? As someone who just left the academy back to the pastoral office, what was it?
I have my own theory about this, which I haven't read anywhere, but I haven't read all the McDonald scholarship, so maybe it is somewhere. And it will come in some of the other lectures. But I kind of think he was self-sabotaging his ministry. I think he didn't think it was his true calling and was deeply, deeply ashamed that he was taking money from the church when it wasn't his true calling, and needed to find a way out. But he had a family and small kids, and so in the kind of lore of everyone, the family, his son's biography, and everybody since then, it's all about the theology. But you can tell from the letters that the guy is not handling his pastorate wisely and well. He's just making boneheaded mistakes, and he's trying to get out, I think.
I was wondering what Dr. Hine thinks about that.
Or anything, for that matter.
What do you think about that thing on ministry? You're the McDonald scholar. Serious.
One thing that comes to mind when you start about incarnation and atonement is this old caricature and stereotype that Protestants are interested in the atonement and Catholics in the incarnation. And then you say, well, 1850, there's this shift that reminds me of Roman Catholic aggression and the rise of Catholicism in England and so forth. And I have no theory of this whatsoever, and I wonder what's happening with Catholicism here. Are there any intimations and suggestions of, you spoke of congregationalism, you mentioned broad church. What's happening there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer in Roman Catholicism, but the Anglo-Catholics, the Tractarian High Church movement, is leading the way on incarnational theology. Lex Mundi, the religion of the incarnation. Charles Gore does his Bampton lectures on the incarnation. He writes probably like 4 books on the incarnation. So they love it, and it is partly a revived Platonism that's part of that, partly the privileging of John's Gospel. Michael Wheeler's book on St. John and the Victorians shows you how the Victorians really locate their kind of Christ in John's Gospel, and I think that's part of it. But I don't know what's happening with Roman Catholic theology, but it would be interesting. And, they have the crucifix to leave crucicentrism central. So part of what happens with this very overdone incarnational theology is the soldiers in World War I find it inadequate. They're in the midst of ghastly death, and the whole focus on the baby Jesus is not doing it for them. But they're in France, and there's all these crucifixes around. And the soldiers, in a kind of popular theology, rediscover the theology of the cross as about the fact that bodies get killed and tortured, which seems to be a theology that is gritty enough to speak to their reality.
That's related to a question I had with the church history is sort of filled with examples of inadvertent consequences.
Yeah.
And Descartes is kind of the classic example that comes to my mind. What were the inadvertent, what do we still even taste today in terms of the inadvertent consequences of McDonald's emphasis on the Incarnation? And did that in any way create a pattern of leading with the comfortable dimensions of the faith culturally that we're still the inheritors of?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, obviously, I'm not pinning this all on McDonald. He's part of a trend, but it's amazing how the season of the cross is gone, and Good Friday is so insignificant in the lives of many Christians, let alone the wider culture. So Christmas has just completely won out as the season, and that gets amplified in the wider culture. And so, yeah, I think there's a consequence of what we're living with is a serious distortion of the church year. And again, you can say the same thing about Pentecost, and so, yeah, I think that's one thing to think about in light of this.
So I'm teaching a first-year seminar right now, and we just had a few weeks ago, we talked about evangelicalism in the class, and I used a portion from the Cambridge Companion to Evangelical Theology, and kind of introduced students to the Bevington Quadrilateral and the Larsen Pentagon. And both stress the cross, right? So there's crucicentrism,
yes.
And you talk about evangelicals stressing the atoning work of Jesus Christ on the cross. So I'm going to build off that question a little bit. Could you talk a little bit about the age of the Incarnation in relation to evangelicalism? Did the emphasis on the Incarnation after 1850 shape the development of evangelicalism, or how do we get back to the place where the atonement's so central, or have we never left in spite of the shift?
Yeah, so I'm actually researching and trying to write a paper on this now, again, specifically with congregationalism, which is McDonald. So there seems to be that there are clearly people who ride this incarnational wave in a way that just takes them out of evangelicalism, that it's a way of developing a liberal theology in the sense of being able to just jettison parts of the historic faith that seem uncomfortable to them or untenable to them. But there are people throughout who are deliberately trying to hold them together a little bit. So R.W. Dale, who I put up, and he, though I read the thing where he says the move has been from atonement to incarnation, he in his own theology, he wrote a huge important book on the atonement, is trying to hold them together in the age of the Incarnation. And as like I said, P.D. Forsyth seems to me the key theologian who really kind of rights the ship for people. So I think there's an evangelical emphasis on crucicentrism that does continue throughout, but there's a more of a understanding of the Incarnation, which again is a good thing. Before the age of the Incarnation, it was very common, like I said, for evangelicals to ignore Christmas altogether, or if it was Christmas, you would often have a sermon on the cross on Christmas. And you literally get sermons that say he was born to die, and now let's talk about the crucifixion. It's on Christmas Day. So it needed a corrective, but it needed also to hold on to atonement. And there are people who do that. And as I say, in the early 20th century, I see this emphasis happening once again for multiple reasons.
Maybe one more question, and then I get a bonus question, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'd have to ask this, but is there an age, is there a doctrine that defines our age, and is there a part of the church here we need to recover today? Wow.
Wow.
Maybe you hinted at with Pentecost.
Yeah, we are definitely an age of experience, I think. And so I think what people will look back on our age and see how much people's personal life experiences were normative for how they thought about theology, and the willingness to accept that unreflectively. I heard a great paper at the Conference of Faith and History in October, which was on the House. Christian speakers established their authority and legitimacy not by an MDiv degree or ordination or whatever, but by telling a tragic story about their life. That becomes, I have an authority to speak because I've experienced something. That's what I would see as a hallmark of our time. But
You noted that McDonald loved Yuletide ghost stories and gave books as Christmas gifts, and I know that your family has a tradition of reading a story aloud at Christmas. So I wonder if you could conclude by giving us some recommendations or a recommendation for our own Christmas gatherings, ghost story or otherwise.
So we already read aloud together Uncle Peter, the story that I started with, and that's fun. We read Oscar Wilde. We read Louisa May Alcott. We read I'm blanking. Those are some ideas.
That's great. Tim, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Great food for this season in particular. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming.